This is a lecture on the Book of Numbers by me, and my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. The Book of Numbers is in many ways a miserable book, for it tells the story of how the first generation of Israel grumbled and complained and failed to enter the land of promise. The title of the book is based on the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, the LXX, which gives it the title Arithmoi. And Numbers refers to the censuses of chapters 1 through 4 and also chapter 26, where they count how many Israelites there were. The Hebrew title is In the Desert, and that's a good description of the book too, because at least much of the content of the book is while they were in the desert. Anyway, the Hebrew title simply takes the first words of the book and makes that the title of the book. Authorship. The author of Numbers is the same as the author of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus. Those four books are all originally one book. And it continues the story of Leviticus. We conservatives will argue that it's essentially Mosaic authorship with some updating. Liberal scholars, the Wellhausen School, will say that this is primarily P-source intertwined with J and E. Will adopt the conservative position, essentially Mosaic. Geographically, the book has movement. It starts with Israel camped at Mount Sinai, and that will cover through chapter 10 and verse 10. But then they will move to Kadesh Barnea. That's chapter 10, verse 11 through chapter 20, verse 13. And then at Kadesh Barnea, it turns out that they had a failure of faith and refused to enter the promised land. And so Kadesh Barnea is very important for the story of Numbers. But then they will move from Kadesh to Moab in the last part of the book, chapter 20, verse 14, through the end of the book. From Kadesh Barnea to Moab on the way to capturing Jericho in the promised land. Chronologically, there's a movement of some 40 years in this book. So they start off at Mount Sinai, and they're camped at Mount Sinai where their population is counted, and they receive further laws and instructions. But then they travel to Kadesh on the southern border of Canaan. But because of their tragic unbelief, Israel is condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But then at the end of the 40 years, the Israelites move from the desert to the land of Moab on their way to conquer Jericho. That's the structure of the book, chronologically speaking. The censuses cover chapters 1 through 4 and chapter 26. And both censuses, one before the 40 years and one at the end of the 40 years, count about 600,000 men. This would be about 2.5 million total if you were to include the women and the children. Now, there's a theological lesson here in that the number is about the same at the beginning of the 40 years and at the end of the 40 years. During this period, God did not bless Israel with increase in numbers due to the judgment on Israel's unbelief. Now, there is a historical problem with the censuses. Are the censuses too large to be real? Now, liberal scholars will reject the censuses as wrong. Liberal scholars reject the numbers listed here as too large. After all, it would take a miracle for so many to live in the desert, and liberal scholars don't believe in miracles. For evangelicals who do believe that God performs miracles, the manna, the quail, the water, and the rock, this argument cannot be accepted. But nonetheless, let me give you the account of what liberals will say. Well, some will say that the numbers are just made up. For example, see Earl W. Davies, A Mathematical Corundum, The Problem of the Large Numbers in Vetus Testamentum in 1995, who argued this very thing, that they were just made up. Some will say the text is garbled and has to be reduced somehow. They will take the word thousands, Aleph, and say, well, maybe what that word really means is something like clans, and if it only means clans, then that might be less than thousands. Anyway, that would be a way of making the numbers a bit smaller. In any case, liberals reject the numbers in part because it would take miracles for so many people to survive in a desert where there wasn't much food or water. The traditional conservative view, on the other hand, is that the numbers are possible. If couples averaged about 4 or 5 reproducing children each, starting with 70 individuals, as it says in the beginning of Exodus, going to Egypt, over 430 years, they could grow to be about 2.5 million people. On the other hand, even conservative scholars find the numbers difficult. For example, it says that there were 7 nations in Canaan greater and stronger than you. Deuteronomy 7 and verse 1. Well, if you take 2.5 million and multiply it by 7, that would be more than the current population of Israel in modern times, and the current population in Palestine in modern times is the largest it's ever been. And moreover, it says in chapter 7 and verse 7 that Israel is the fewest of all peoples. And that's hard to reconcile with a population of 2.5 million. Also, it says that the midwives, there were 2 midwives who served the Israelites, according to Exodus 1 and verse 15. But how could 2 serve such a large number? Of course, there's ways around that. Maybe they were the leaders of the midwives rather than the only ones that were doing it. You have 600 chariots of Pharaoh that terrified 600,000 men, according to Exodus chapter 14. But how could a mere 600 chariots terrify that many? I mean, just by number, they could clog their wheels and overtake them if they just charged together. And so that seems a little odd. At the Battle of Ai, the Israelites are emotionally devastated by the loss of 36 Israelite men, Joshua chapter 7 and verse 4. But what is a loss of 36 men if there are 600,000 to start with? And so for all these reasons, even some conservative scholars find the numbers to be a little hard to accept at face value. One scholar, David Fouts, argued that perhaps the numbers are deliberate hyperbole. If you take the numbers and divide them by 10, instead of 600,000, make them 60,000, well, that would make the numbers seem more reasonable. It is interesting to note that the numbers all end in a 0. But anyway, you can read about Fouts' argument in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society in 1997, and another conservative scholar, Vaschholz, Military Censuses and Numbers in Presbyterian in 1992, argued something similar. It's possible that the Book of Numbers is following some other convention that's now unknown to us. And so we'll just have to leave the ultimate solution to this problem to the future. Well, let's talk about the arrangement of the tribes around the ark in chapters 2 and 3. The camp of Israel was carefully planned with the tabernacle at the central place in the organization of the camp. Here's a chart that kind of shows how it worked. The tabernacle was in the middle of the camp, and then it was immediately surrounded by the various Levite tribes, as you can see in green. To the east, facing the rising of the sun, was Aaron and his sons, the priests, and the other Levites served as the maintenance people for the tabernacle. And then the other tribes, with Judah in the far east as ultimately the most important tribe, and Ephraim in the back, which is the second most important tribe, surrounding the tabernacle, as you can see in the chart. Now, only the Levites could serve the sanctuary, and the Levites were considered a substitute for the firstborn. Originally, it was the firstborn who served as priests in patriarchal society. But according to Numbers 3, verses 11 through 13, at this time, the Levites are now a substitute for the firstborns, and they are the priestly tribe. Now, priestly matters are interspersed throughout the book of Numbers. One example is the famous priestly blessing of Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 27. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. A line which is often quoted by preachers in modern times as a conclusion to their sermons. This line is also found in a text that was discovered, the Katif Hinnom silver amulets, which were 7th century texts on silver rolled into kind of a scroll containing a version of this blessing. It's the earliest quotation of a biblical verse that we have found heretofore. Dates to the 7th century BC, 600s. Now, the book of Numbers has various laws. And let me mention some of those laws just to give a flavor of the kinds of things that are found in the book of Numbers. For example, you have a law that would give a test for suspected adultery in Numbers chapter 5, verses 11 through 31. It involved a ritual in which a woman accused of adultery by her husband, but he has no evidence, he just suspects it, would go through a ritual of self-curse where they would drink the water of curse and pronounce a curse on themselves if they in fact committed adultery. And the purpose of this law was to curb the lynch mob mentality and protect the hapless woman from false accusations, because if she went through the ritual, drank the water, took the curse, and nothing happened to her, well, the man was obligated to be quiet and no longer accuse her of wrongdoing. Then there's the Nazirite law of Numbers chapter 6. A Nazirite was either a man or a woman who made a special type of vow. During this time of the vow, it indicated a time of separation, a special separation to the Lord. Paul in the New Testament took a Nazirite vow. You read about that in Acts 18 and verse 18, and completing the vow in chapter 21 and verse 23. By New Testament times, it typically lasted for 1 month. Nazirites, while they were under their oath, were to avoid the following things. They were to avoid anything made out of grape, so they couldn't drink wine, they couldn't eat grapes. They were to avoid cutting their hair, and this plays a role in the famous story of Samson in the book of Judges. And they were not to touch anything that was dead, also playing a role in the story of Samson. Another law is that Sabbath violators were to be put to death. Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 through 36. A man who was gathering firewood on the Sabbath violated that law, and they took it so seriously that they executed him for that violation. And this just illustrates how seriously Israelites were to take the keeping of the law. And then in Numbers chapter 19, you have a ritual purification for corpse contamination. If you touched a corpse, you were ceremonially unclean. And part of the ritual for re-entering a state of ceremonial cleanness was a ritual involving the ashes of a red heifer. The ashes of the red heifer mixed with water and sprinkled on the unclean person served to purify them from ceremonial uncleanness from a corpse. And all of this reflects the holiness of God and the separation of God from anything having to do with death. And then you have laws about murder in Numbers chapter 35. In the law here, biblical law distinguishes between deliberate murder and unintentional manslaughter. Deliberate premeditated murder was a capital offense, but unintentional manslaughter was not. For unintentional manslaughter, you were confined to the city of refuge, which was a priestly city, until the death of the high priest, at which time you could resume your normal life. Another law is the case of the daughters of Zelophehad in Numbers chapters 27 and chapter 36. The problem there was the handing down of inheritance. Normally, inheritance went to sons. But what is one to do when there were no sons? In such cases, the law allows inheritance by daughters with certain limitations. And this represents expanded rights for women as compared with the ambient culture of that day. Let's go on and talk a little bit about the narratives of the book of Numbers, and in particular, how the first generation failed to reach the promised land. Now, the book of Numbers more generally is characterized by various rebellions and complaints in the wilderness. There's kind of two themes. The people were unfaithful. They showed ingratitude. They were short-sighted. They showed unbelief. God, on the other hand, was faithful. He guided and protected them in the wilderness. There are a number of examples of unfaithfulness in Numbers chapter 11. There's complaints about the manna. They were sick of eating manna day after day after day. Now, God had provided manna for them as food, but the people wanted meat. And so God gave them the miracle of quail so that they had meat to eat, where the quail flew so low they could knock them down and get the birds and then eat them. Although God sent a curse with that as well, a plague followed. And then in Numbers chapter 12, you have complaints even from Moses' siblings, Aaron and Miriam, who challenged Moses' leadership role. This was on the occasion of Moses' marriage to a Cushite woman. Cushite woman may have been a woman of Ethiopian descent. Anyway, Aaron, the brother of Moses, and Miriam, his sister, used this as an occasion to rebel against his authority. Miriam, at that point, was temporarily struck with leprosy as punishment for her rebellion until she was healed after Moses prayed for her. And then later on in Numbers chapter 16, you have the rebellion of Korah and the followers of Korah. Korah also rebelled against Moses' leadership. He basically argued that there should be priests from tribes other than the Levites. This test involved incense in fire pans, where the followers of Korah offered up incense to God. At this point, the ground opened up and swallowed Korah and those that followed him. In Numbers chapter 21, you have the story of the bronze serpent. People were speaking against God and Moses when they became weary of the journey. And so God sent fiery serpents. And some debate whether fiery is what they look like or fiery is what their bites were like when the venomous snakes bit people. But in any case, they were saved from death from these serpent bites when Moses created a bronze serpent, put it on a stick, and lifted it up. And whoever looked in faith upon the bronze serpent was healed of the viper wounds. Jesus refers to this incident and compares it with his being lifted up on the cross in Numbers chapter 3 and verse 14. Just as when people looked in faith to Moses' serpent on a stick in the book of Numbers, they were healed of their snake venom bites, so those who look to Christ on the cross being lifted up are healed of the venom of sin. But it's in Numbers chapter 13 and 14 that is the key event in the narrative of the failure to take the promised land. And this occurred at Kadesh Barnea. Spies were sent back from Kadesh Barnea to check out the promised land, and they found it was a land flowing in milk and honey. In other words, it was good for cattle and good for sweet things like grapes. You can see on the map where Kadesh is. It's just south of the promised land in the Sinai desert. And they sent spies into the land to check out the land at that time. Now, there was a problem with the land. The people who inhabit this country are very powerful, and the cities are fortified and large, in Numbers 13 and verse 28. The majority report was then this: the land is good, it is a land flowing with milk and honey. The enemy was, however, too powerful to defeat, and so they were discouraging, and they led the people to want to simply turn around and return to Egypt. On the other hand, the minority report consisted of two of the spies, Caleb and Joshua. And in chapter 13 and verse 30, it says, "Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, 'We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it.'" And also Joshua in chapter 14, verses 6 through 8. Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will swallow them up. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." Joshua and Caleb showed faith. They looked not at the strong enemies, but at the strong God who could allow them to overcome strong enemies. And they encouraged Israel to enter the land. But unfortunately, as the story continues, the people as a whole sided with the majority report. They railed against Moses. They rejected his leadership. They ignored the pleas of Joshua, Caleb, Moses, and Aaron. And even some of them made plans to return to Egypt, all in Numbers chapter 14, verses 1 through 9. At that point, God appeared at the tabernacle. And he then appeared to Moses, threatening to annihilate Israel for its unbelief. Chapter 14, verses 11 through 12, the Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me despite all the miraculous signs I performed among them? I will strike them with a plague and destroy them. But I will make you," speaking to Moses, "into a nation greater and stronger than they." And so God, in effect, said to Moses, stand aside, let me wipe these people out, and I'll complete my promise, but I'll do it through you and not the people as a whole. But then Moses intercedes in prayer in order to prevent God from destroying the nation. Moses said to the Lord, "Then the Egyptians will hear about it. By your power you brought these people up from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land about it. They have already heard that you, O Lord, are with these people, and that you, O Lord, have been seen face to face, and that your cloud stays over them, and that you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. If you put these people to death all at one time, the nations who have heard this report about you will say, 'The Lord was not able to bring these people into the land he promised them on oath, so he slaughtered them in the desert.' Now may the Lord's strength be displayed, just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. In accordance with all your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now." Now Moses is saying, in effect, that, if you destroy them, it'll ruin your reputation. The nations will say that it's because you were not able to bring them into the land of promise that you destroyed them. And moreover, please act according to your more gracious nature. You say you're slow to anger and abounding in love and forgive rebellion and sin. Act in accordance with that and forgive them. Well, God's response to Moses' prayer is, yes, I will forgive them. I will not destroy them. And yet there must be a punishment for this offense. And so his decree is that everyone 20 years up in age would not enter the land of promise. Now at this point, the people are all upset. And now they say, well, yes, we will enter the land, but it was too late. Some of them organized a foolhardy attack, and despite God's statement, some of them tried to enter the land anyway in chapter 14, verses 39 through 43, but they were repelled by the Amalekites. And thus begins the 40-year wilderness wanderings. And we'll continue this story in the next lecture.